The 23rd of August, the Media Ukraine Center is functioning. I'm Svetlana Cheparenko. Welcome everybody on this day of national flag. We are talking about the Kursk offensive. Are the Russians anticipating Prigozhin's resurrection? We'll be talking about the takeaways from the Sociological survey. Vadym Denysenko, Igar, Tyshkevich, and Volodymyr Nahirnyi are joining us today. Vadym Denysenko, today marked the 1 year since reportedly Putin ordered Prigozhin's murder. Some people compare his march on Moscow with the Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region. What are the major takeaways of yours in terms of the Ukrainian offensive? Comparison perhaps is the wrong word. Analogies perhaps are a better way to describe. What we can safely say that for many Russians, to be exact, 47% of the Russians believe that Prigozhin is still alive, and he enjoys the popularity level not less than the Minister of Defense, Belousov, and much higher than the General Gerasimov, the head of the General Staff. What are the insights that you know, and what are the major takeaways? The survey was done in the territory of the Russian Federation. It was conducted by the Dilova Stolytsia newspaper and the New Image Group. In collaboration with them, we've been doing this kind of research in the Russian territory. We can not only talk about the current situation, we also know the comparisons with what happened before. To begin with, the question whether what are the drives in the situations in Russia. If we look at the situation over the period of the research, effectively, the worsening of the situation in the front lines or in Russia in general, the issue whether this trend is right or wrong is at the level of peaking number of 73%. So we can safely say that Kursk is a good direction, only 69%. Unfortunately, this is very bad, and this is a stable figure. To go below this is very difficult and non-realistic as of now. The way I see it, we can talk about tectonic differences and changes in the Russian Federation will reach the notch point of 55%. So all this says about some vacillations. What is exciting here and is worth talking about is the question in what way the so-called limited military operation, their word for the war. The question is whether the people believe that they have reached the results. 34% believe that yes, and 20% believe that no. In general, we have the 50-40 situation. Compared to the May of 2024, we see the growth by 20% of people who don't believe that they have been successful, and 5% lower among those who believe that results had been achieved, which is very symptomatic. In reality, these figures reflect also those who are afraid of answering honestly. One of the most important issues for us is the value of peace. Our question is, what matters for you most, the ceasefire or the new territories acquirement? We see the dynamics of these figures compared to May 22. 58% believe that there should be a stoppage to the hostilities, and with 40% believing that the war should go on. We see a 20 12% of difference as of August 2024. There is a set of answers why this has happened. But before answering this question, we should look at these figures. This is most principal thing in this survey. We look at the demographic issue of answering of the so-called demilitarization of society. It was not a surprise to us, these relations of different age groups. The younger generation are against the war, and in general, they stand out of the general background. To me, what matters is the age group of 35 to 44. This age group is becoming demilitarized, and we saw the trend a year ago, but the Russian authorities have been very successful in stemming down this sentiment. The failure in the Ukrainian counteroffensive was one factor. The positive for the Russians and the negative for us, developments in the front line. And third point is that the Russian authorities have been successful in ensuring the Russian population that there will be no mobilization. We should be aware and understand that people are facing either mobilization, and the Kursk offensive has shown a lot of weaknesses, and the Russian authorities want to focus on their successful in the Pokrovsk region at the front line. We see 44 or rather 50-50 percentage relation between those who are for the war and those who are rooting for the end of the war. The most militarized strata of the Russian population are the basis for the Putin regime. The classic question that we are asking is this: imagine that Putin has announced the end of the special military operation. You see that only 20% don't support this idea. 20% of those. Next slide is a thing that we have always, over the last months, one of the questions that we are asking the Russians. Since this month, it is safe to say that the Russians have now become aware and strongly aware about their losses in the hostilities. 40% of the Russians now believe that casualties are north of 100,000, and 24 of those who have opted for the answer difficult to say. We can say that they understand what's going on, but they're afraid of saying it honestly. So the general trend over the last months is that half of the Russians are not afraid to say that the casualties of Russians are in the ballpark of 100,000, in spite of the Russian authorities' effort to minimize this figure. Let us compare with the 2022 May, when virtually the figure 100,000 was supported by 28%. We have seen an increase here. 20% of those people that are sitting on the fence. And some trends say that demilitarization of the Russians perhaps is too strong a word, but people tend to be demilitarized. Now, as for the general trends, the picture is not as rosy as we would like it to be. The question is, do you believe that we should conduct peace negotiations? You see the figures here that 26% say that no, we don't have to. But when we ask how such peace negotiations should be conducted, the picture is negative, 42%. And 42% is the electorate that are ready to stop the war now. This is the potential that is there, that basically this is the human potential that we can work with for it to grow, for such a people, their number to grow. There are conditions that people attach. Condition that we have control over Kiev, 20%, other conditions, 18%, and with no strings attached, 7%. Kiev control plus never a negotiation with Ukraine. Sociology says that there are 33% of those. At the beginning of the war, it was down to 22%, which is to say that over this anti-Ukrainian rigid electorate has grown by 10%. Unfortunately, this trend is very negative for us. On a separate note, we have looked into the relations with China. A year ago, China was the biggest hope of the Russians, and Russia lived in the framework of the First World War, when Serbs said that with Russians we are very strong. Now we see drastic changes. Russians start to look at China in a different way. There is some cooling down of relations between Beijing and Moscow. The question is whether you agree that China needs Russia only as a source of natural resources. There are a number of questions here. For example, as an opposition to the United States, China needs Russia to bring Chinese people here to Russia. They don't believe in what we here in Ukraine want to believe, that China will overcome Russia tomorrow. Only Russia can set up peace negotiations with Ukraine. 20% of those believe in that option. 20% of those don't believe that China is a factor in this war. And 19% don't believe that Russia has any stake in this war. So run-of-the-mill Russian doesn't believe that China is a major actor here. The relations between China and Russia, equal cooperation, 74%. China is playing its own game, 66%. We see diametrically different answers here, and Russia is playing its own game, 51%. Here, we have the so-called double think, when the same person answers in different ways. What matters for us is the 66 and 51 figures, when majority of people believe that China is using Russia. Now we are switching toward the question whether the trust of people to key politicians, 70%, which is down 4 to 5% compared to the previous period. But this oscillation of 6% that I mentioned, it is relevant to them. These 6% is a difference that Putin's popularity has seen in the Russian population. Trust to Russian military is somewhere at the level that we have here in Ukraine. The army will be playing a major role, a political factor. But the Russian authorities do everything they can to eliminate this factor. Traditionally, the third trusted politician is Foreign Minister Lavrov, 71%, Mishustin 74%, and government in general more than 60%. In general, the executive branch enjoys large popularity and trust compared to that rating in Ukraine. This is one of the stabilizing factors in the Russian Federation. The male bloggers are trusted. Kadyrov 54%, Belosov, new Minister of Defense, 51%. Plus, and many people don't know who that is, Moscow mayor is also enjoying popularity, Patriarch Kirill. And now we come to Prigozhin that enjoys 64% of distrust, which is less than to Patriarch Kirill. Mr. Medvedev enjoys a negative popularity, 40%, and 50% don't. Patrushev, 36 plus. Sergei Shoigu has seen a drastic decline. Before he was dismissed, and this is a tradition, such people lose their popularity. Nabiolin traditionally has been very negatively viewed. Gerasimov, 29, and Nadezhdin, 18% of trust. As of now, the last point is the conditional so-called Russian opposition. The question is, do you believe that Prigozhin is still alive? Positive 7%, 40% believe that maybe. 37% are sure that he's dead. And there are people who don't know how to answer the question. Now, we wanted to gauge the popularity of the new Minister of Defense. He's been in office for 3 months now, and there has been a lot of messaging and information campaign to support him. Many people believe that he could be equal in popularity with the top 5 nominees. The expectations that were there, it is very clear that he has failed, and the Kursk offensive has been a positive factor in bringing his popularity down. Now that he's been in office for 3 months, can you say what changes have you seen? Situation in the military defense industry. The situation has been better, 44%, it doesn't change, 49%, and many people cannot answer whether yes or no. So there is no serious changes here. Situation on the front has been better in spite of the Pokrovsk front line. 34% believe that it's been better, 35% nothing has changed, and 14% believe that the situation is the status quo. Corruption in the army, a major drive behind his nomination. The fight against corruption has been better. 29% believe that it's been good, and 10% believe that the situation is worse. That is to say that he has not been able to change the perception. And occupied territories, these are the results of the research. This is the classical example of the inertia and the how people are frightened. People know that part of the Kursk region has been occupied. The 35% of those asked don't want to see it. They turn away from it. The corruption issue. About a year ago, the Russian authorities, the military corruption has been on the top of the issues, and they imitate the fight against corruption. Unfortunately, we can say that it has brought good results and positive fruit. And it changes the mass consciousness of the Russians. The question is, can you evaluate the fight against corruption fight? And 9% only say that this fight is at a bad level. We see the relations and trust to the local government, to the police, to the medicine services, courts, and education. What is important for us, we can say that in general, corruption is not a very popular topic. Let us remember that here in Ukraine we believe that 70% want the corruption to be taken away from our lives. And a special question was, who is driving toward the Russia meltdown? For us not to have any illusions. And unfortunately, Russian propaganda has made sure that they know what they are fighting for. Only 16% that believe they don't have enemies. Many people believe that some people want to make sure that Russia is dismantled. So many Russians do believe that the rough external forces they want to destroy Russia. And you see the numbers here, the collective West, now the United States, followed by Ukraine and the Russian opposition members. So propaganda has been successful in making sure that Russians believe that they are fighting the so-called collective West. I would like now to talk about the trust of the Russians of President Putin. The level has been stable from month to month, from a year to year. The support is there and support is strong. But this survey has shown and unnerved the issues of corruption and the enemy issue. Do you believe that there are some prospects for this trust to go down? The level of support for President Putin has traditionally been high. It's perhaps lower than it was shown officially at the election day, but totally it is a very high performance. The other issue is that over the period of this survey of the Russian society and the political process, we can state that the peak of the Putin support and his popularity is behind us. But there are no reasons to claim that after this plateau we will see the drastic decline in support. However, what we are seeing is the serious changes in the social dimension of this support. Our figures and indices show that his supporters are growing old. The major part of the youth, people of the middle age group, on a number of questions express some estimates and answers, provide answers that are not, shall I say, typical for the Putin supporters. And such a high level of support is conditioned upon the fact that there is no alternative. There are no others who would embody any other point of view. The liberal opposition and Boris Nadezhdin, who has been pictured in our survey as a conditional embodiment, the most notable figure. So the liberal opposition has lost a campaign for the Russian vote, for the Russians in general. What can we say when we talk about the future? The prospects that we are seeing is that there are some changes toward the attitude to war, reminding ourselves of the key messages of the liberal opposition is that this is Putin's war. In fact, this is not the case. This is the war of the Russians. The war is very popular, and there is a powerful nucleus somewhere at the level of 33%, which is 1/3 of the population, and this nucleus is supported by those who want to fight this war until the victorious finish. But the share of the older people in his bases indicates some processes that must be looked into very seriously because they matter for us. Once the message of Putin's war, and only him, is not the message of the Russian liberal opposition, but is the message of the Russian people. This will be the key factor, amongst others, when the social base will be only older people. When and if these indicators go down, only then will we be able to talk about a new room for opposition, and will be a place for people and elites to start talking about the change of the leader. But the lesser his election base is, the more chances there are for new changes in Russia. So far, this is only the beginning of the process, and there will be oscillations and changes. Perhaps the changes within Russia will be taking place, but they're not war-related. But as for the dynamics we have seen so far, within a year, for example, the peak is behind us, and this movement of popularity will be going down. These different visits of the Russian leader to Chechnya, I think, have to do with this. He seems to understand that there are problems in the public sentiment, including their attitude towards war. A number of people has been growing who don't believe that the special military operation has failed, has not reached its goals. The goals have not been reached, but they have to be reached. The other question is whether they are not possibly achievable. In other words, what sociology tells us is that we are seeing the beginning of the turbulent period prior to presidential election, during the presidential election, when they were talking about blitzkrieg on the Russian conditions. Now they seem to realize that this will not happen, and accordingly, this is only reflected in the lower ratings of trust. But in the Russian system of values, this is only a relative matter, but it is a wake-up call, perhaps, for Putin's authority. Igor, can I turn to you now? We've seen a general trend, but Russia is a big country, region-wise and locally. There are national minorities, and in terms of the vicinity to the front lines, what are the regional dimension? I wouldn't talk only about region-wise strata. We have not published all the available information, but this research is conditioned on the question, how does it relate to reality? So I will take from here, the question is not whether the direction is right or wrong. The question is how successful has been the campaign that is called in Russia the military operation. Trust. Prigozhin can hardly be called a Democrat. He wasn't against Putin, I'm sure. He was against the then Minister of Defense. He was the only person of radical, ready to go on fighting, that didn't belong to the system. How does it correlate? Everything is very simple. Look at the crisis in the Russian Federation that was connected to the Kursk offensive. Logically speaking, it would make sense to appoint a responsible person. What has Putin done? He has diluted responsibility. Prime Minister is responsible for general picture. Social issues are tasked with other people, Secret Service, and so on. So the answer is very simple. What has Prigozhin done? He took on the mantle of the savior of Russia. He was claiming the victory of the Bakhmut city. The Kursk is another trigger. Can you imagine a single person who would claim, I have saved great Russia? This will be a political figure of the first rank, whoever that may be. But if there are many people responsible for that, there is no single savior of Russia. But if the campaign fails, if there is one person responsible, he is guilty, and guilty is the person who has appointed him. And, otherwise you are looking for a goat that will be responsible for everything. The support for war. Of course, the Caucasus is an important issue. And the regional autonomous republics. Yes, there might be some statistical mistake, but this is not the first time we are gauging the temperature there. Here, it is not a coincidence that Putin goes to to Chechnya, into that region. One, the Russian authorities have been using the format of war and participating in the war against Ukraine as a social lift for the national minorities, for them to be the Russians of the first rank. Otherwise, you are slandered, and there are many nicknames for national minorities in Russia. This is the first point. For these regions, the question is, what did we fight for? Another issue is that has to do with the Kursk campaign. You saw the conflict between a Chechen fighter and military bloggers. You saw the situation when their speaker, the Kadyrov speaker, could oppose those who are speaking from the front lines. This is a menacing factor. And the third factor is the vantage point that we have not included into the presentation. Apart from the age, we also have a analysis of the Slav population that are going to Ukrainian war, that have been hired, the Southern Military and Urals military region, because they are paid very high salaries. They are seeing people dead coming home, but they were striving to get some money, but they came back, sorry, just as a body in a black bag. So there are some triggers in those regions. However, it doesn't make sense to claim that there will be the situation in Russia will be destabilized. Putin still enjoys high popularity, and except the Prigozhin case and this savior of Russia case, a hypothesis, we are all talking about two people close to Putin. The closer they are, the more popularity they enjoy. The Shoigu case is very indicative of that. This is as far as our expectations for the swift changes. go. It's not a matter of the liberal opposition, as Vadym has said, that there are people that will not change their sentiment. We've been talking about the results of the social research on whether Russians are waiting for the second coming of Prigozhin. We'll be meeting back at 1200 hours. We'll be talking about the women's movement in Ukraine. Stay tuned.